Heavenly Father, we thank you once again for your goodness to us, Lord, and allowing us to be able to meet like this from all over the world, different cultures, different backgrounds, and even different languages. And yet we can share in this thanks to you, thanks to your Holy Spirit, thanks to your salvation. So, Lord, we ask that you take this time, use it for your glory. We ask that you'd bless the speaker, give him your words of wisdom and the things to say. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. If one of you would monitor the chat and maybe relay some questions on to me as it's appropriate. Okay, good. Church history of Hungary. The history of the Protestant Church in Hungary is a bloody history. Thus says historian William Potter. He's known as Billy to me. I used to beat up on him when he was a little kid, but now he's 6'5", and I don't dare do that anymore. But he is truly a historian. This is going to end up sounding like a political history, and that's because you can't extricate the religious history from the political because they're so bound up with one another. The state is always trying to control the church, and the church is always trying to control the state. So, Hungary is a country in Central Europe that is at the same time unique and representative of Central and Eastern Europe. Hungary has a history of invasion similar to Poland. It was on the losing side of 2 world wars. It suffered from communist oppression following the Second World War and was the first country to revolt from the Soviets. Along with most of Eastern Europe, it gained independence beginning in 1989. The last of the Soviet tanks rolled east out of Hungary in 1991. And that was a great day in Hungarian history. But the Hungarian culture and language are in many ways unique. Hungarian is nothing like German or the Slavic languages of the surrounding countries. The closest modern relatives are Finnish and Estonian, but the relationship is a very distant one. When I hear people speaking Finnish, when I'm at kind of a distance, it sounds to me like Hungarian, but when I get close, I don't recognize a single word. So it's not like the difference between, say, Spanish and Portuguese. The uniqueness and difficulty of the language helped to keep Hungary isolated. We have a problem even defining what we mean by the word Hungary. The citizens of the country call it Magyarország. The borders of the country have shifted considerably over time. Before the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, Hungary was 3 times the size it is today. Since most of what I want to talk about concerns Hungary before World War I will define Hungary as the territory of Greater Hungary as it was before World War II. Sizable parts of Romania, Slovakia, Croatia, Serbia were once Hungarian territory. And just to make a comment on somebody said last time, well, the reasons part of Hungary was cut off was because it was on the losing side of the World War. True. But did 2/3 of Hungary get, 2/3 of Germany get taken away from Germany? Did 2/3 of Japan get taken away from Japan? To Hungarians, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and I can sympathize with that. In the case of the First World War, they were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and since the Austrians went in on the side of the Germans, the Hungarians were more or less forced to as well. As far as the Second World War is concerned, they'd had so much territory taken away from them in the First World War that they saw their chance to get the territory back if Germany and Italy won. On the other hand, they had a choice of, do you want to be on Hitler's side or on Stalin's side? And the obvious choice is none of the above, but that one wasn't available to them. The Christian history of Hungarian territory dates back to Roman times. The oldest Christian tomb paintings of the world outside of Italy are in Pécs, Hungary. That's the city where I live. Pécs at the time was called Sopene, the capital of the Roman province of Pannonia. The Huns, a warlike tribe of horsemen, swept through the Carpathian Basin from the east during the 5th century AD, led by Attila, whom the Western Europeans dubbed the Scourge of God. They plundered cities and towns all the way into Italy and Gaul. The Hungarians were effective against unorganized opposition, but not against well-trained and well-disciplined soldiers. When Attila died in his early 30s, the Hunnish invasion stalled and the Huns disappeared from history along with their language. However, Hungarians still consider Attila to be a hero, and they name their sons for him. I know several Attilas. He was really no worse than the quote-unquote Christians of Byzantium and Rome against whom he fought. The next momentous event was the invasion of the 7 Magyar tribes from the area east of the Ural Mountains under the leadership of their chieftain Arpad. 5 of the tribes continued west from Hungary but were unable to conquer areas protected by armies and fortified castles. The Hungarians are proud of their ancestors, concerning whom the Western Europeans used to pray, God save us from the arrows of the Hungarians. The biggest contribution of the Magyar tribes to the country were the sense of government by consent of the governed and a very complex language. I recently read somewhere that someone claimed that Sanskrit must be impossibly hard because verbs could have as many as 500 inflectional forms. Hungarian has well over 5,000. No one knows exactly how many. Hungary first became a nation with the ascent of Vik, a descendant of Arpad, who became the first king of Hungary after receiving his crown from the Pope in the year 1000. He changed his name to István, which is the equivalent of Stephen, and forced mass conversion of the country in what we must call a civil war. After his death without an heir, the country lapsed back into political chaos and paganism. He had invited monks from other countries to come in and educate the pagans there to be Christians. And one of them, Gellert, was put inside a barrel on the top of a hill in Budapest, what's now Budapest. And they pushed the hill off the cliff and he rolled down to his death. That's now known as St. Gellert Hill. Other members of the House of Arpad were able to gain control and restore order to the country, along with adherence to Roman Catholicism, and they ruled for the next quarter millennium. The plains west of the Carpathian Mountains are open ground for invasion, and Hungary has been invaded much by its neighbors and even by distant outsiders. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century, though the Hungarians were able to repel them, left perhaps half of the population dead. And the monarchy greatly weakened. Repopulation came from surrounding countries, which at least in part explains Hungary's large number of citizens of Slavic descent, though they are not Slavic either linguistically or culturally. And I say that there are a large number that are of Slavic descent because of genetic testing that's been done. If you did genetic testing on the average Hungarian, and he found out he was Slavic in his ancestry, he would be surprised to know that. The next great invasion came from Turkey. Having conquered Constantinople in 1453, the Turks moved on toward the European heartland. Their first barrier was Hungary. In 1456, they battled the Hungarian army led by John Hunyadi at Belgrade. The Hungarian victory kept the Turks at bay for another 70 years. While Hunyadi was just a military leader, his son Mátyás became king. A very forward-looking young man, he decided that he wanted his country to be part of the West rather than the East. He brought in scholars and books from the West and promoted education. Many Hungarians rate him as their favorite king, though in reality, the reality of his rule was not as good as the legend that grew up afterwards. One of the legends was that he used to dress in peasant garb, and he used to dress in peasant garb and go around and spy on the nobles. And if he found the nobles were abusing the peasants, he would punish the nobles. That's probably not true. The next, okay. One may wonder at this point why we pay so much attention to the politics of the country when we are really interested in the spiritual. You cannot separate the two, particularly when the church and state are joined, as in both the Roman and the mainline Protestant systems. The winner of a particular battle may determine whether one has religious freedom or persecution. So we're about to enter the period of the Reformation. Let's pick up on what has happened religiously up to then. My chief source of information is History of the Protestant Church in Hungary, author unknown, published in 1854. That is the English version, at least, and reprinted by Mo Press, 2001. The author was a Hungarian expatriate living in Switzerland in the 1850s. The introduction to the book is by J.H. Merrill d'Aubigné. Anybody ever heard of Merrill d'Aubigné? Raise your hand. Okay, a little bit about him. In 1816, Scottish businessman took an extended vacation in Switzerland, and he spent a lot of time in Geneva. Have any of you ever heard of James and Robert Haldane? Let's try that one. No, okay, one shaking the head, yes. James was a Baptist preacher. His brother Robert was a businessman. They both inherited substantial family wealth, and Robert added to it with his business activities. But he was also a careful student of the Bible. And when he was in Geneva and met the men who were training for the ministry there, he realized that they weren't even saved. So he held a Bible study in the apartment where he was staying, attended by about 30 of these divinity students. And during that time, those divinity students were saved. Merrill d'Aubigné was one of those. And he became one of the greatest historians of the Reformation. His multi-volume History of the Reformation is a classic. And when you read Merrill d'Aubigné, you have no reason to doubt which side he's on. I think he tries to be fair, but he knows who the good guys are and he knows who the bad guys are, and he doesn't hesitate to tell you which one is which. So our anonymous author had access to documents that are no longer available to us. Although this is a secondary source, we prefer primary. It's all that we have from much of what it narrates, because those other sources are just not available anymore. There were a considerable number of Waldensians in Hungary by 1300. Simeon Scaliger, a Hungarian Waldensian, was among several who were burned at the stake in Vienna. After a time, the time of John Huss, or Jan Hus, Waldensians became known as Hussites. We remember that Huss, you've all heard of John Huss, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. He was burned at the stake at the Council of Constance. He'd been given safe conduct to and from Constance by the emperor. He was there to defend his views from the scripture. But the premise of the Council of Constance was that the highest authority of the church is the ecumenical council. They wanted to wrest control away from the Pope, and their answer was the ecumenical council. So if the council had allowed Huss to defend his views, it would have undercut its own legitimacy. Huss had to be silenced. Hence, the Roman emperor rationalized his crime by saying, "No one is bound to keep faith with heretics." Aeneas Sylvius, who later became Pope Sylvester II, listed some of the views of the Hussites as follows. The Pope is not above other bishops. There is no purgatory. Pictures of God and the saints should be abolished. They denied the validity of confirmation, extreme unction, and the confessional. Prayer to the saints is useless, and every man has the right to preach the gospel. I'd have a hard time denying any one of those. In 1444, an attempt to destroy the Hussites failed because the papal forces had broken a peace treaty with the Turks. Constantinople fell in 1453. At first, the above-mentioned Matthias, in other words, persecuted the Hussites, but ceased when he was better informed. Persecution increased after Matthias's decease and the ascendance of his son Laszlo. The official beginning of the Reformation was the posting of the 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Church in 1517. By this time, there was very little sincerity in the Roman Church. The sale of indulgences set off Luther's wrath. These sales not only helped to fund the Pope's lavish building projects, but also the army fighting the Turks. The army became a group of marauders, pillaging any and everyone wherever they went. Decrees against the Hussites were not carried out when the noble was a Hussite. Besides this, the clergy of Hungary were generally despised. Germans in Hungary kept a close connection with their native land. Merchants traveled carrying Luther's writings. By 1520, Luther had many adherents in Hungary. Perhaps as much as half of the country embraced the Reformation. Among Luther's followers were Mary, Queen of Hungary, and sister of the Emperor Charles V, and her chaplain. Charles, you may remember, presided over the diet of worms that condemned Luther. At the insistence of Cardinal Cajetan, Louis II, King of Hungary, issued a decree that, quote, all Lutherans and those who favor them, as well as adherents to the sect, shall have their property confiscated and themselves be punished with death as heretics and foes of the Most Holy Virgin, end of quote. The order was never carried out. A not so funny thing happened to Louis on August 29, 1526. His small force, outnumbered 15-1, met the vast army and superior military technology of the Turkish emperors Solomon at Mohacs. He was advised not to retreat and not engage the Turkish army in battle and wait for reinforcements, but he did not. Total carnage, 7 bishops, 28 princes, 500 nobles, 20,000 warriors. The king and a cardinal legate were killed trying to escape. Solomon advanced rapidly on Buda, and that's the part of the modern city of Budapest that's on the west bank of the Danube. Arriving on September 9, Solomon set the city on fire, including the 40,000 volume library that had been accumulated by King Matthias. Solomon advanced, ironically, the battle had a positive effect on the spread of the gospel. Many of the foes of the gospel were killed. The Hungarians proceeded to elect John Zapatoya, a Transylvanian prince, to be their king. The Archduke Ferdinand of Austria also claimed the throne. Zapatoya tried to please the bishops, creating 2 martyrs in the process. Ferdinand, however, was much worse. He proclaimed against Lutherans, Anabaptists, and Zwinglians. Informers were to receive 1/3 of the fine or confiscated property of the Protestants. He was not able to enforce his decrees, however. Many nobles protected the Protestants. And I want to say a word here about the Anabaptists too. a lot of times it's hard to know what it means when you read the word Anabaptist, just like if you're reading in the newspaper and you read the word fundamentalist, what does that mean? We have our own definition. We know what it means, and we're all very positive about that. But people in general don't understand what it means, and it's somewhat that way with Anabaptist. Historians divide the Anabaptist into 5 groups: anti-Trinitarian, mystical, social revolutionary, and chiliastic, plus biblical Anabaptists. And of those 5, we would only identify with the biblical Anabaptists. In 1529, Solomon was at the gates of Vienna, and in 1530, Ferdinand tried to retake Buda, but was thrown back to Komarom. A note on the House of Habsburg. We need to say something about the House of Habsburg, because it's going to figure in our story all the way to the end. This family will appear repeatedly as the rulers of Austria, Hungary, and the Holy Roman Empire. The family first became noble in Switzerland in the 11th century. At one time or another, in addition to Austria and Hungary, Habsburgs occupied the thrones of Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, Bohemia, Croatia, and even Mexico. They were always a force to be reckoned with. Most of them were fiercely loyal Roman Catholics. The Council of Augsburg in the middle of 1530 produced the classic statement of Lutheran doctrine, written by Philip Melanchthon. Confession of Augsburg attempted to bridge the gap between the Lutherans and the Catholics. That is, it was kind of a compromise document, but it failed to do so. The confession became the standard statement of Lutheran teaching, and it circulated among the educated Hungarians who could read Latin. Mátyás Bíró of Deva, who had studied under Luther and Melanchthon in Wittenberg, returned to his homeland to spread the gospel. He pastored the Church of Kosha, which is now in Slovakia. Ferdinand had him arrested and imprisoned under duress for 2 years. Freed after the Diet of Augsburg, he visited Luther again and returned to Hungary in 1537. He moved to northwest Hungary to work under the protection of the local count, where he labored indefatigably. Ferdinand ordered a disputation to take place in 1538. The Catholics always hated that, with Stephen Sontai representing the Protestant side. The monks made a lot of noise, but were unable to stop the disputation from going forward. I'm talking about literal noise. They screamed and yelled and did all kinds of things to drown out when the Protestant was speaking. The umpires of the dispute reported to the king that everything Sontai said was backed up by scripture, and that what the monks said were fables and idle tales. But, they concluded, should we state this publicly, we are lost, for we should be represented as enemies of our religion. If we condemn Sontai, we act contrary to the truth and justice, and would not escape divine retribution. The monks demanded the death penalty, but by now the king understood the truth and would not condemn Sontai. Out of fear for himself and for Sontai, he sent Sontai to Transylvania, where he could receive protection. Ferdinand knew the truth, but he was afraid of Rome. As much as the Hungarians hated the Turks, they preferred their rule to the Austrians because of religious freedom. Let that sink in a bit. The Muslim Turks were more religiously tolerant than the Austrian Catholics were. A parade of future Hungarian preachers went to Wittenberg. By 1541, the whole New Testament was available in Hungarian. German communities in Hungary tended to embrace the Reformation, possibly because so many spoke German. Melanchthon carried on an extensive correspondence with ethnic German Hungarians. By the way, that German business continues to this day. My former co-worker is the son of a Hungarian who emigrated to the United States. And this man's father's first language was German rather than Hungarian, although he spoke both languages, plus English. Just when the Protestants needed unity in their struggle against the Catholics, they fell to fighting over the nature of the Lord's Supper. By this time, Biro had changed to the Zwinglian view. More on this later. We need here to maybe sort out. Can anybody tell me the 4 views of the Lord's Supper? Okay, I will tell you the 4 views of the Lord's Supper. The first, you'll recognize these terms once I say it. The first is transubstantiation. When the priest utters the magic words, hoc est corpus meum, which is the origin of the expression hocus pocus. Literally, that's true. The host actually becomes the very body, blood, and divinity of the Lord Jesus Christ. Though the host may retain the outer form, like the taste, smell, and feel of bread, that's called its accents. In other words, that's just what it looks like. What it actually is, in essence, changes. This is the Roman Catholic view. Second view, consubstantiation. In the Lord's Supper, the body of Christ is present in and around the elements, but the elements themselves do not change. This is the Lutheran view. The real or spiritual presence. In the Lord's Supper, the Lord is somehow present in a way that conveys grace to the recipient. This was Calvin's view, and it's the view of many Protestants. And then we have a symbolic view, that is, the Lord's Supper is a symbol to remind us of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. The benefits of the Lord's Supper spring from our own remembrance and appreciation of that sacrifice. This was the view of Zwingli.
Zwingli, right.
So that was the view of Biro, Mátyás Biro. About this time, a new school was established in Tasnyad for István Kiss of Szeged. He was abused, deprived of his library of 200 books, and ejected from the town. He went on to labor effectively in Gyula and Cegléd. Those are both cities in modern-day Hungary. A school opened in Timisoara, and Kiss was invited to teach there for 3 years, and he was ejected from the city in the providence of God just before the Turks invaded and slaughtered a whole bunch more people, and God preserved his life that way. The Pasha favored the Protestants. Among the many who converted were several Catholic bishops, one of whom may have been poisoned. So there were a number of Catholic bishops even who converted to Protestantism. The Archbishop of Esztergom, that would be in northwestern Hungary, tried to quell the Reformation in his territory but was unsuccessful. This frustration led to the fateful decision to invite the Jesuits to enter into the country. And now we're going to be contending with the Jesuits for a couple of 100 years. The 2 major tenets of the Jesuits were absolute obedience to their superiors, and if the end is good, any means necessary to meet that end is justified. That's known as Jesuit casuistry. The end justifies the means. And when you combine those 2 things together, it's a very dangerous mix. They're allowed to lie, cheat, steal, and even murder, as long as it's to the greater glory of God. Their goals in Hungary were to restore the dignity of the Pope, to root out evangelical religion, and to spread popery. The Jesuits wanted to win over Maximilian, the heir to the throne, to their side. They succeeded in winning over the Queen, but Maximilian banished them. So they went to Hungary. By 1563, old laws were resurrected, allowing persecution of the Protestants. The Protestants took their eyes off the ball and argued with one another over the nature of the Lord's Supper and an obscure doctrine called the ubiquity of the human nature of Christ. Has anybody ever heard of the ubiquity of the human nature of Christ?
Mhm.
Yeah, well, you're like me on that one. Until I read this book, I'd never heard of it. If you think about that, it's like the human nature of Christ is present everywhere at the same time. Ubiquity, it has a meaning similar to omnipresence.
Okay, yeah.
If Christ's human nature is ubiquitous, then it's not a real human nature because humans are not ubiquitous. So if you think about it for a minute that way, to me, that settles it. Anyway, they argued sharply with one another about it when they should have been thinking about how they could defend themselves against Roman Catholic attacks. So the Protestants were prepared to divide over this issue. The Reformation in Hungary was now divided into Lutheran and Reformed. Okay, the Lutherans were mainly ethnic Germans, and the Reformed were mainly ethnic Hungarians, if that makes sense. Okay, the Germans more logically would be Lutheran because Luther was a German. And I can't get off on that rabbit trail. I'll have to go on. In 1564, the Council of Trent ended, and with it all hopes of reconciliation between Catholics and Protestants. Everybody know what the Council of Trent was?
Yes.
Okay, rattle your head. Good. The Archbishop of Esztergom persuaded Ferdinand I to threaten those who adhered to the Augsburg Confession, but the edict was cut short by Ferdinand's death. In many ways, he was a good ruler, but he was ignorant of the Word of God. Maximilian succeeded Ferdinand. The Archbishop of Esztergom tried to take control of the empire's policy on religion, but Maximilian stopped him, believing that Catholics and Protestants should coexist peacefully. Gaspar Karli commended the Swiss Confession in Transylvania at about the same time, and a synod at Debrecen adopted it. So the Protestants in Transylvania were mainly Reformed as opposed to Lutheran, although there were Lutherans there too. Unitarians began to multiply, especially in Transylvania. In answer, the Hungarians adopted the Confession of Tengyer in 1567, which became the standard confession of the Hungarian Reformed Church. In 1572, István Kiss died after a number of close scrapes with death. We remember him as the Hungarian Melanchthon and Mátyás Bíró as the Hungarian Luther. Maximilian died in 1576 with the Roman Catholic Church on the wane in Hungary. While he was kind to the Protestants, he died a Roman Catholic. Rudolf, Maximilian's successor, was not favorable to the Protestants. He was strongly influenced by his Spanish mother and by the Jesuits. In his youth, he traveled to Spain to visit his uncle Philip, King of Spain. There, Rudolf was influenced by Torquemada. Is that name familiar? Torquemada? Yeah, some of you are shaking your head. Yes. He was the head of the Spanish Inquisition. A very, very cruel man. As king, Rudolf was more interested in alchemy, astrology, and painting than he was in the affairs of state, and he was always short of money. So he was just, in general, not a very good king. In 1577, Rudolf gave the Jesuits free rein in Austria. He started banishing Protestant preachers while the Protestants were disputing doctrines rather than preparing for the coming persecutions. Rudolf put great restrictions on preaching in Sopron in 1584. That's right on the Hungarian-Austrian border. The Protestants responded by attending services in 2 villages outside of the jurisdiction of Sopron. The Jesuits now entered Transylvania and Middle Hungary. Okay, so let me give you a picture here of what's going on. We have Greater Hungary, which is 3 times the size of Hungary currently. The country is now divided into 3 zones. The western third is controlled by the Austrian king. The eastern third is mainly Transylvania, and that is controlled by princes that they elect, and it owes allegiance to the Turkish Pasha, the Turkish ruler. And then the central part is ruled directly by Turkey, and the central and eastern part have much more religious freedom than the west. Okay, Jesuits now entered Transylvania and Middle Hungary. Okay, so up to now, they've only been in Austria, but now they come in the middle part of the country and also in the eastern part of the country. Under Muslim rule, all sects were tolerated. By 1592, there was strong infighting between Lutherans and the Reformed. We should also note this time that Gaspar Karolyi in 1592 completed and published his translation of the whole Bible into Hungarian. This translation, since revised several times, remained the standard Protestant Bible until the latter part of the 20th century, and it is the Bible that we use at our church. At a diet in Bratislava in 1604, the king announced that he would no longer hear appeals concerning injustices done to Protestants. Clergy were burned on piles of their own books. Some were flayed alive. Famine followed with a strong backlash. The king lost control of all of Hungary east of Sopron. Okay, remember, Sopron is right on the Hungarian-Austrian border. In fact, it's really should theoretically be an Austrian territory. If you look at a map, the border goes like this, and when it comes to Sopron, it goes like this, and then down again. Sopron was given the option of whether they wanted to be part of Hungary or part of Austria, and they opted for Hungary. And because of that, Sopron is known as the Faithful City. In 1606, the king negotiated a peace with the Hungarians that conceded that he had tried to enforce old law that was null and void. Protestant church buildings, which the Catholics had confiscated, should revert to whoever held them before the conflict started. Jesuits would not be allowed to own real estate. In the new order which followed, the Catholics broke their word everywhere except in Transylvania. Rudolph turned over direct rule of Hungary to his brother Matthew, but only after Matthew had raised an army of 20,000 men. Rudolph had made himself hateful to all Hungarians, not just the Protestants. The Peace of Vienna was the act that the Protestants appealed to whenever they needed to assert their rights. Okay, that was the end of this conflict between Rudolph and his brother. In 1618, Matthew died and bequeathed his crown at the insistence of the Jesuits to his nephew, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria. The Hungarians agreed to this, but only after insisting on their own right to elect their king. Remember, Hungarians inherited from the Magyars this belief that the people ought to be able to determine what their government is. So they made an agreement, but the Jesuits amended the agreement subtly in their favor before it was finally ratified. This same year was the Defenestration of Prague. Everybody know what the Defenestration of Prague was? Okay, that should have been in some of your reading. That was the start of the 30 Years' War. The words of Fenelon would be very appropriate for Ferdinand after the death of Matthew. None but a fool desires a crown. In the 100 years since Luther, conditions in Europe had never been so ripe for a conflict, largely due to the work of Pope Clement VIII and the Jesuits, and Ferdinand II, the new king of Hungary, was adamantly Roman Catholic. The Jesuits clandestinely returned to Transylvania in 1691. The Protestants responded with persecutions of their own. Gabor Bethlen, by the way, he's the man who translated the Heidelberg Confession into Hungarian. The Heidelberg Confession is the classic statement of the Reformed faith. He executed Jesuits in Kassa and conquered Bratislava, but refused to be crowned king of Hungary. He once again banished the Jesuits. In 1621, an influx of refugees arrived from Moravia and Bohemia. Remember, there's a big war going on at this time. And as the armies go back and forth, lots of people are displaced because they're of the wrong religion, whichever one that happens to be. Bethlen marched to the aid of the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. Ferdinand then named the Virgin Mary as the generalissimo of his army. And in doing so, he kicked out the one man who was really competent to lead it. What would the Protestants expect from someone who names the Virgin Mary as commander of his army? He was merely a puppet in the hands of Cardinal Carafa and others. Ferdinand had ignored the provisions of the agreement he signed in 1606. Bethlen saw no alternative than to march on Vienna. He received a promise of aid from the Turks. Ferdinand was in a weak position. He could not afford to defend himself in an attack from the east and from the west at the same time. Bethlen agreed not to fight so long as Ferdinand maintained liberty for the Protestants. Okay? And that's going to last about as long as the danger lasts. And when the danger is over, it's gone. As soon as Bethlen died, the Catholics renewed their oppression. That was 1629. Protestants appealed to the king for restoration of church buildings confiscated by the Catholics, but all in vain. In 1637, Ferdinand II died and was succeeded by Ferdinand III. The people demanded the restoration of their religious liberty before they would agree to help the king stave off the Turks. But many of the nobles had come over to the Roman Catholic side. Two of the nobles went so far as to start a sword fight and had to be restrained. The king was finally forced to grant toleration in writing, but by the influence of the Bishop of Esztergom, the document was never officially entered into Hungarian law. So the king signed it, but it never got into the law books. So they could say, well, that doesn't count. By 1642, the Protestants were looking to George Rákóczi, Prince of Transylvania, for help, but he did not respond right away. Eventually, he entered into league with the Swedish general and declared war on Austria. Ferdinand again issued promises, but no one believed him. Persecution continued. The war ended with a peace of Linz in 1645. Protestant preachers who had been exiled were allowed to return. Protestant property was to be restored. The king supported these provisions over the objection of the Catholic clergy. Ferdinand IV was crowned to succeed his father as King of Hungary in 1647, and he promised to hear and redress Protestant grievances. An aside here, you read about the 30 Years' War. Historians consider the 30 Years' War as a religious war between Protestants and Catholics, but that would be an oversimplification. France intervened in the war on the side of the Protestants to curb the power of the Habsburgs. Since Louis XIV was not yet of age, this decision was made by the regent, and the regent was the Roman Catholic Cardinal Richelieu. We have also noticed that the Turks were willing to become involved. The war had many political aspects as well as religious. Unfortunately, Austria and Hungary were little affected by the Peace of Westphalia, 1648. After the death of Rákóczi, the Jesuits again crept back into Transylvania. Church buildings restored to the Protestants were again taken away. In some places, the Protestants were persecuted out of existence. In 1649, a Roman Catholic, but a man of good character, Paul Palfy, became the king's chief administrator, and the Protestants enjoyed a respite. During this respite, Jesuits concentrated their efforts on Transylvania. Since the Society of Jesus had been banished, they represented themselves as something other than Jesuits. George Rákóczi II discovered their new tactics and had them expelled again in 1651. All at once, 1654, Ferdinand IV, Ferdinand III, and Palfy all died. Remember, Ferdinand III is the king of Austria. Ferdinand IV is the king of Hungary. They're in the same family. But Ferdinand III was in many ways a good king. If the Jesuits had not been constantly at his elbow to influence him, he might even have been a great king. Leopold I took the throne of Austria and Hungary at the death of his father and his brother. This was the golden age of the Society of Jesus, and Leopold was being groomed to become a bishop. But he became king because of the death of his father and brother. He might have been a good bishop, but he was a terrible king. In 1658, the Turks invaded, and the king persuaded the Protestants to put off their grievances until a better time. They agreed, but regretted it later. In 1659, at a new diet, the Protestants petitioned for redress concerning confiscation of property, particularly for the 40 church buildings that had been confiscated in the previous 3 years. They gave names and history of what had happened. One county official, Paul Esterhazy, who had obtained permission from the Pope to marry his brother's daughter, tried to persuade the Protestants on his estates to convert to Catholicism. When that failed, he confiscated another Protestant church building. Francis Nadasdy, a judge, sent Austrian and Hungarian soldiers to abuse the Protestants. One village was empty when they arrived. They chased down the inhabitants and forced them to convert. Protestant pastors were banished and their furniture broken to pieces. One man had 2 of his oxen confiscated because his wife refused to convert. Nadasdy directed the keeper of the forest to watch for Protestants who went to neighboring Protestant church for worship. When they returned, they were robbed and their clothes and sent home naked. Do you get the picture? The conditions can be pretty bad here.
Yes.
This is the normal condition of things, folks. We live in an exceptional period of time in exceptional places. But this is the way it is in a lot of the world, and this is the way it was the world over almost for much of Christian history. Count Erdődy not only turned Protestant pastors out of their homes in the dead of winter and threw their furniture onto the street, he made a list of all the Protestants on his estates and ordered them to convert. If they did not, he ordered them to be banished and only allowed to take 4 forints with them for their journey. When this did not produce the effect he wanted, he billeted his soldiers on them. Everybody know what billeted means?
Yes.
Okay, I'm getting some yeses. Just to make sure, that means that by law you are required to allow soldiers to stay in your home and you have to furnish food for them. When that was not sufficient, he imprisoned them in a castle until, worn out, they could no longer resist. It may be easy to stand for Christ in a time of enthusiasm, but it's more difficult to stand over a long period of oppression. It wears you out. In the estates of John and George Lippi, all Protestants were ordered to attend Mass and fined 40 forints for every time they missed. Protestant widows were not allowed to marry. No Protestant could hold public office. At Dreux, no Protestants were allowed to practice their craft, builders, shoemakers, tailors, or any trade. The aforementioned Count Nadasdy had the Protestant chaplain Stephen Pilarik arrested. All of his property and his books were burned in the castle. They put his Bible on a spit to roast it over the fire while the count and others looked on. A sudden blast of wind blew several leaves of the Bible into the air, and one was driven directly to the count's breast. One of the barons caught it, but the count seized it out of his hand and began to read these words from Isaiah 40. The grass withereth and the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever.
Hmm.
The count's face turned deathly pale, and he left the courtyard. While he was leaving, the court fool cried after him, "How shall you feel, Sir Count, when the devils are roasting you on a spit in hell?" More churches were confiscated, and preachers turned out of doors. One peasant cried out, "If you thrust the wafer into my mouth, I will bite off your fingers." More soldiers were billeted in people's homes. At another diet, the king refused to hear the grievances of the Protestants, who petitioned him 6 times. More than just the Protestants were dissatisfied with the quartering. Now the Austrians defeated the Turks at St. Gothard in 1664 and concluded a peace without consulting the Hungarians. All the Hungarians, no matter their religion, resented this decision and also the quartering. Leopold tried to persuade the Turks to oust the Calvinist Prince Opafi and replace him with Francis Rákóczi, a Roman Catholic. The Austrian court openly said that the Hungarians needed to be humbled. Hungarian nobles, including Count Nadasdy, conspired against the king. The cabal included some of the bitterest persecutors of the Protestants. They tried to poison the king and nearly succeeded. Naturally, the Jesuits blamed the conspiracy on the Protestants. Even the man who informed the king of the plot was imprisoned. Protestants were imprisoned, but most of the leaders of the plot fled to Transylvania. And I think this may be a good time for us to break off.
Yes.
Okay?
Okay.
Break?
All right. Yep, I have 1 minute to 9. So let's break for 5 minutes and we can come back. And
Okay.
if you have any questions, we will pick up from there.
Okay, good.
Good, great.
All right. See you in 5.
Right.
Okay, are we back? Good.
Yep.
The trial of the conspirators was not done according to law. In 1671, Count Nadasdy was condemned to death and executed. His last words as he mounted the scaffold were, "The Lord is just in all his ways." The Protestants interpreted this to mean that he repented and returned to the Protestant faith of his youth. The Catholics interpreted it to mean they understood that his condemnation was just. Who knows which one is correct? 300 Hungarian nobles received various punishments. Some of them were executed. An interesting side story concerns a man of the Moravian Brethren who lived in Hungarian territory, Nicholas Zabik. Somebody who knows Czech can help me pronounce that correctly. Who had written a book against the king at the age of 84. He was executed. His hand was cut off first, then his head. Before he was killed, he was promised liberty if he converted to Catholicism. So at 84, he did. But then he recanted his recantation when he recognized that he'd been lied to and they were going to kill him anyway. Also in 1671, the king began a campaign against Hungarian free cities, which elected their rulers and protected the Protestants. More church buildings were confiscated, violence erupted. In Stenitz, in 1673, after some Protestants had been killed, a mob attacked and killed some Catholics, bringing down the wrath of the king against them. The military intervened and killed indiscriminately. In Bratislava, the authorities dusted off a 40 years out of date edict ordering the Protestants to turn their church buildings over to the Catholics. Even after a trial and royal edict and the request of the parishioners, church officers refused to give up the keys. The authorities had to break down the doors. For the crime of asserting their rights and obeying the orders of the king, Protestant pastors were thrust into prison by the Catholic Count Colonitz. After extracting an oath from them never to return, they were permitted to claim only 12 books each from their libraries. And the Lord prospered all of these men in exile. All of them had good, fruitful, productive ministries. In 1672, with the Turks and Transylvanians knocking at the door, more Protestant church buildings were returned. The insurgents reclaimed church buildings, but they went too far in abusing Catholic priests and monks. This hurt their cause, although they treated the Catholic priests no worse than Catholics had treated Protestant clergy. The Austrian army attacked and routed the invaders. The Austrians used the abuse of the Catholic clergy as an excuse to persecute the Protestants. All previous gains were now reversed. Protestant pastors were seized and brought before kangaroo courts. 2 of them defected. Churches were deprived of pastors and forbidden to call new ones. The worst outrages were yet to come. Now, this is the part of the story that really is heart-wrenching to me. The Archbishop of Esztergom summoned between 250 and 400 pastors to appear at Bratislava, even though many of them lived outside of the king's realm. Did he have a right to do this? Probably not. The Pasha forbade anyone from his domain to attend. That would be central Hungary, although a few did. Possibly they hoped that their voice would be heard. I don't know why, but it was a mistake. The court was 100% Roman Catholic. So they were to be judged not by their peers, but they were to be judged by people who were opposed to them. Judge, jury, and executioner, the same. The court condemned all of them alike on flimsy charges and sentenced them to beheading, with all their goods confiscated. Though this sentence was never carried out, the pastors were put in a position of having to accept exile rather than execution. And that's what their opponents really wanted. A substantial majority refused to capitulate. The group remained firm even after a few of them were thrown into a dungeon. Then all the Lutheran pastors were imprisoned. Finally, all the Calvinist pastors were also imprisoned. The prisoners were scattered among real criminals and could not communicate with one another for encouragement. Some of them, both Lutheran and Calvinist, yielded. More torture followed. One pastor was beaten to death. 33 pastors were, quote unquote, set free to serve in the galleys of ships in Italy. This outcome was apparently not intended by the king and was added by the priests. 6 died on the way to Italy from cruel treatment. One of these was just left on the road unburied. 3 escaped. 20 left for Naples, 2 of which were set free in Hungary. Another escaped and was recaptured. 3 more died on the way. 7 recanted. The rest were condemned to the galleys, despite earnest pleas from many in high places. And of course, service in a galley as a galley slave was like a sentence to a relatively slow death under torture. The galley slaves were finally released in 1674 under pressure from the Dutch government. And that story is a lot longer than I have made it, but how terrible. The Jesuits were embarrassed. They claimed, the Jesuits were unembarrassed. They claimed that pastors were guilty of murder, the murder of some priests. The priests had been killed by common criminals, and the pastors had no connection with the deed. Curiously, the trial of about 300 pastors had lasted for only 4 weeks, and all were alike convicted of the same crime and condemned to the same sentence. We should remind ourselves that Turkish-controlled territory allowed religious freedom, while pastors in Austrian-controlled territory went into hiding. If caught, they either had to renounce their faith or die in prison. Priests sometimes dressed as Protestant ministers in order to sniff out the places where the Protestant ministers were hiding. The Protestants of Sopron promised to give up their churches and pastors if they would be allowed to practice their religion in private homes. The Protestants again made a petition to the king in 1681. Leopold made a decree granting religious liberty, but the Roman Catholics were able to retain a large number of church buildings that they had confiscated from the Protestants. On the whole, this decree was better than the status quo, but it was never signed or sealed, so it didn't count. In all, 888 church buildings had been taken. Imagine sacrificing your money to build a church building and then have it stolen from you to be used by the people that you're opposed to. The Protestants also petitioned the king to allow the return of exiles. The king gave a verbal message granting, yes. Did you have a question?
No. So, yep.
All right. The king gave a verbal message granting part of what they asked for. Catholic laymen at the Diet were responsible for the gains the Protestants made. With the help of the Turks, Imre Tukeli laid siege to Vienna in 1682. Churches and schools were returned to the Protestants. The Jesuits were again removed. Okay, so he swept over the whole country, all of Hungary, and he's on the gates of Vienna. So everywhere he's gone, religious liberty is restored. The Jesuits were again removed. Tukeli and the Turks withdrew, and before the end of the year, things returned to the way they were, and in some places even worse. Protestants lost their jobs. Some of them lost their freedom if they did not recant. Some of you already know what happens next. The Austrians pushed back against the Turks. Hungarians and Transylvanians fought alongside the Turks against the Austrians, who were backed by French money. The war was very cruel. The war went back and forth, each side claiming church property when their army was in control of the territory. Tukeli switched sides, knowing the reprisal that awaited him if he did not. The Austrians prevailed, taking Buda in 1686 and proceeding to take the central part of the country back. Severe persecution followed. Carafa, the man in charge of the reprisals, hired men to devise more cruel tortures. Okay, so this guy paid people to figure out ways of making others suffer more. Men were hung, drawn and quartered, beheaded. Anyone who asserted after an execution that the victim had been innocent himself received the death penalty. So it was a death penalty if you say that this person who was executed was innocent. So for his efforts, Carafa was given a medal by the king. Many of the Protestants just got up and left. Protests from other nations were of no avail. Local authorities had free rein to persecute without fear of retribution. Paul Esterhazy, the richest man in Hungary, used his powers as a landowner to further the persecutions. Cardinal Kolnitz's motto was, "I will make Hungary first captive, then poor, then papist." Francis II Rákóczi of Transylvania, the stepson of Tukeli, was now elected Prince of Transylvania in 1701. He was a very talented, intelligent young man. The Austrians saw him as a danger and imprisoned him, but he escaped by means of his mother bribing the prison keeper. The prison keeper was killed for that, but the mother paid off the dead man's family. So she kept faith with him that way. He found shelter in Poland, and the King of Poland refused to surrender him to Leopold. In 1705, Leopold died, and on his deathbed, he advised his son Joseph, whatever the ministers say, make peace with the Hungarians. Demand the fulfillment only of the conditions of the last Pressburg Bratislava diet and the right of inheritance. Whatever else the insurgents may demand, yield it, however hard it may appear, that you may then be able to protect the whole kingdom from foreign invasion. Leopold's people gave him the title the Great, but Hungarians would not agree. He was not even a just king, for the Hungarians had to protect themselves from him and his courtiers as they would from robbers. What brought him the most honor was due to the work of his general, Eugenius Savoy, and his foreign ministers. The only thing for which the Hungarians can remember him fondly was the good advice he gave to his son on his deathbed. Joseph followed his father's advice and gave religious freedom to the Hungarians. Fresh leadership emerged in the Protestant churches as exiles returned home. New schools were constructed. In 1707, Rákóczi's advisors influenced him to rebel. His good fortune now forsook him. Joseph I and Rákóczi vied for the support of the Protestants, even though both of them were Catholic. Okay, understand this. Rákóczi is on the east in Transylvania, and Joseph is on the west in Austria, and both of them need the Protestants on their side in the struggle between the two. Rákóczi unwisely continued the war. Joseph remained loyal to the Protestants even when the danger passed. In 1710, he issued an order to the Archbishop that the Protestants should not be disturbed. Joseph died an untimely death from smallpox in 1711. The Dutch and British brokered a peace between Rákóczi and the Austrians. Rákóczi's followers were received no ill treatment. Rákóczi went into exile, eventually residing in, of all places, Istanbul, where he pursued his hobby of making furniture until his death. Charles VI succeeded his father. The Catholics took the opportunity of renewing their abuses, but Charles issued edicts to try to stop them. Priests stirred up riots and then punished the Protestants for inciting them. Charles tried to do right by the Protestants, but he was in a difficult position. The Jesuits claimed that none of the rights promised to the Protestants who had been under Austrian rule before applied to the territory that the Turks had ruled. Okay, so the Protestant says, we have these rights, and the Jesuits said, no, you don't, because those decrees were issued when you were ruled by the Turks, so it doesn't count. Furthermore, the Catholics wanted revenues that supported the churches on the grounds that the church had been built by Catholics, even though no Catholics resided in the district. In other words, a priest would be supported to minister to no one, and the Protestants who used the church would receive nothing. So there were generally lands connected with the church buildings. Those lands were farmed, and then the farmers paid rent to the church, and then that was used to support the pastors. So this is what's going on. Charles called a diet which was held in 1720, but all attempts at reconciliation failed due to Roman Catholic intransigence. Charles's commands that the persecution should cease went unheeded and perpetrators went unpunished. Okay, you can issue all the degrees you want to issue, but if nobody pays any attention to them, and when they don't pay attention, nobody gets punished, it doesn't mean anything. And that's what the situation was. The House of Habsburg, after centuries of geopolitical dominance, was about to go extinct. There weren't any Habsburgs left. Charles had no male heir, only daughters. To solve the problem, he adopted what's called the Pragmatic Sanction. And by the Pragmatic Sanction, his oldest daughter, Maria Theresa, would succeed him on the throne. Since such a move was almost unheard of, Charles contacted all the major powers of Europe to assure their cooperation in the transition. And all promised to abide by Charles's wishes, but probably several of them had their fingers crossed. It didn't really mean it. The king ordered that all persecutions should cease in June of 1723, but the order was never carried out. The king established a privy council in 1724 to deal with the internal matters in Hungary. Roman Catholics dominated the council, and the council allowed the abuse of the Protestants to continue, denying their rights. The offenses of the council against the crown went unpunished. Okay, so what you have here is the king is delegating his responsibility to judge to a group of the people who are perpetrating the abuses. So they're the abusers, and then they judge themselves too. Decrees issued in 1731 reversed many of the gains that the Protestants had made. The Protestants were compelled to violate their consciences by participating in Catholic religious parades and by taking the decretal oath. This is going to come up again and again. This oath included swearing, quote, by the Mother of God and all the saints, end of quote. Now, no Protestant with a good conscience can say that. The Protestants protested to no avail. One pastor was imprisoned for 9 years. The wafer was forced between his teeth as he lay dying. The Catholics claimed that he had converted. No one could hold public office without swearing according to the decretal oath. Punishments were meted out according to the charge, not according to the evidence. Jesuits had complete censorship over the press. They confiscated pastors' libraries. They also took a whole stock of Bibles from a bookbinder. Since the Turks were advancing on Transylvania, the king had to be mild with the Protestants, but the Jesuits crept back into the country. Soldiers broke into castles and imprisoned Protestant nobles. In 1739, they obtained their release, but the malefactors were never punished. The writer estimates that by the reign of Charles VI, 2/3 of Transylvania was still Protestant. However, the Catholics succeeded in installing a new military governor. In 1716, he reintroduced the Jesuits. They proceeded to change the laws that had afforded protection to the Protestants. These laws had been made under Turkish rule and gave favors to the Turks. This fact became a pretext to alter the laws to be favorable to the Catholics. The Protestants appealed to the king on the basis of rights previously granted in the West. But even in this, the Protestants remained loyal to the king, even in the face of another Turkish invasion. The peace brokered by the English ceded Serbia and Wallachia to the Turks. That was a very sad outcome for them. In 1741, Charles died and his daughter Maria Theresa was crowned as the new ruler. Her position was a weak one, since the land had just been ravaged by war, and her position as monarch, though not unique, was unusual enough to be perilous. She appealed to Hungary to back her, appearing before a diet, holding her baby and making an impassioned speech. "Oh, you've got to protect me and my poor baby. Help us, we need your help." And she solemnly promised to give them their liberties. The Hungarians enthusiastically pledged allegiance to her, not so much because of the promises she made, but because they judged her to be gentle and sincere. Boy, were they wrong. At the time of the coronations, Protestants sent a delegation with a list of grievances. The Queen responded that she did not deal with groups, only with individual cases. The Protestants responded that the abuses they suffered were so pervasive that coming as individuals would be impossible. Pastors and whole districts had been exiled, religious books confiscated, fines and imprisonments imposed, and the Protestants generally abused. They had paid fines so that they would be allowed to remain, then were sent into exile anyway. They objected to the decretal oath. Protestants were not given the right to marry or bury. Bodies were exhumed from graves and left in the open. No Protestant schools were allowed beyond elementary level. Pastors were not allowed to visit the sick. They claimed to have documentary proof for all of these evils. Their complaints went to the private council, which consisted of the people who were causing the distress in the first place. She turned the petition over to her chancellor, who advised her to make no reply. Then she put it to her whole council, who agreed with the chancellor. Even the desire for religious liberty now became a crime. The decretal oath, which had been suspended, was now reinstated. The government made it very difficult for young men to study at universities outside the country. The Bibles and other books were confiscated from traders on their way into the country. Reformed catechisms were ordered destroyed. Schools in Dieu were closed and public worship prohibited. Repair of the church buildings was forbidden. People traveled great distances to worship, and many just left, leaving all their property behind. Popish bishops and archdeacons meddled in the affairs of the Protestant churches. Couples in mixed marriages suffered the most. Many times their children were taken away by the state. There was a case where two mixed couples applied for marriage at the same time. In one case, the groom was Protestant and the bride Catholic. The reverse was true of the second couple. When attempts to convert the Protestants were not successful, the priest married the Catholic to the Catholic and the Protestants to Protestant. Children hid and even emigrated in order to escape conversion. When apprehended, they were imprisoned. The Countess of Sirmai had her servants whipped until they saw the light. Spying on pastors was constant. In 1745, the Protestants presented another petition to the Queen. The response was that for every favor granted, 10 were taken away. So desperate were the Protestants that they appealed to foreign governments for help. The Dutch and Hanoverians, and eventually the English, responded. The most forceful help came from Frederick the Great of Prussia. He wrote to the Hungarian clergy in 1751, protesting their treatment of the Protestants. They forwarded the letter to the Pope, who made a partly conciliatory but non-committal reply. Vienna threatened the man whom they suspected of having made the appeal with chains and imprisonment. The Queen said that Protestants must in future bring their grievances to her and not to appeal to foreign powers. Nothing changed. In 1756, the 7 Years' War broke out. And this war went all over the place, not only in Eastern Europe, but all the way into North America. And in North America, we call it the French and Indian War, but it's part of the same conflict. In 65, the Queen's husband died, and she became more devoted to the Roman Catholic Church than ever. She made her son Joseph co-regent in name, but he had little power. The two came into conflict over the conduct of the Jesuits. When complaints about their conduct came to her, she referred the complaints to the Jesuit order. His mother finally began to understand, but referred the complaint to the Chancellery. I skipped the line. The Chancellery Court, and in the Chancellery Court it died. Joseph wholeheartedly supported the move to dissolve the Jesuit order, which the Pope eventually did because even he was afraid of it. His mother finally began to understand the deceptions of the Jesuits when Joseph showed her a copy of a list of sins she had confessed. The document came from Spain. In 1773, the Jesuits were banned from Hungary and Austria. A new day dawned. While the money and property confiscated from the Jesuits was used to endow new bishoprics, the departure of the Jesuits was mostly a good thing. Although Joseph had been educated by the Jesuits, the people now knew that he would never be a slave of the priests. After so long in survival mode, the Protestants took courage. Just holding services on Sundays was a great advance in many places. Neograd petitioned the Queen concerning the Protestants being forced to pay Roman Catholic priests and schoolmasters and paying for the upkeep of the Roman Catholic church buildings. These complaints were graciously received. More petitions flowed in, and Joseph read them all, promising full religious liberty. Persecutions did not cease simply because the emperor could not be everywhere at once, but the Protestants knew they had a friend in the imperial court. The persecutions diminished over time. The emperor forbade the Roman Catholic priests to go to Rome except through the foreign secretary. The government took action against those who had expelled pastors and seized their books, and expelled the people of the village of Ejeg. The Catholic chapter was found guilty and ordered to allow the Protestants to return to their homes, their houses to be rebuilt at the expense of the chapter, and the church to be reopened. The Bishop of Neutra had permitted the priests to charge exorbitant fees for services rendered to Protestants. He was ordered to return the excess money. In Transylvania, conditions had been somewhat better due to the fact that many of the magistrates were just men. However, under Maria Theresa, abuses increased. They appealed to her on the basis of previous agreements made with Austrian kings. Their complaints were very similar to Hungarian complaints: church buildings seized, imprisonment, compelling of Protestants to join the Catholic Church. These outrages went unpunished. Jews, Armenians, Greeks, and Bulgarians were allowed to build whatever houses of worship they chose, but the Protestants were not. Complaints to the empress were not allowed until they had gone through all the appropriate red tape, meaning that it would be years before petitions were heard. The empress conveniently forgot her oath. Transylvanian students could not attend foreign universities. Questions so far? Do you have any?
Well, I think you were answering the question, so you just proceed, continue.
Okay, what I'm going to do now is I've got a couple more pages here concerning the book, and I'm going to skip on to the end, which is stuff that happened after the, mostly after the book was written, to points of interest, I think, for all of us. And then when I finish with that, I'll go back and pick up where I left off, because I think the last part is maybe the most important part. And I don't want to have class in before I get to it. Robert Murray McCheyne. We normally associate Robert Murray McCheyne with Scotland, his native land, and with the system of Bible reading, read through the Bible in a year that he devised. McCheyne was a powerful preacher and a kind shepherd of his spiritual flock. Andrew Bonar, his friend and colleague, published a biography of McCheyne a year after the latter's death. The biography is a Christian classic. What many do not know about McCheyne was his ministry in Hungary. McCheyne felt a burden to reach Jews for Christ. This burden caused him to make a survey trip to the Holy Land in 1839, along with Bonar and two other older ministers. While there, his health broke, and he had to return to Scotland. By the way, he died at age 30 of tuberculosis. He went overland, and on arriving in Budapest, he was too ill to continue, and he found lodging and rested. While he convalesced, he gained friendship with several local Jews, Among those Jews was Isaac Safar, a respected rabbi. Safar became convinced that Jesus was Messiah and the Son of God and trusted in the Savior. A number of other Jews followed Safar's example. Okay, I wanted to make sure I'd included the note on Safar there. Hungary had become a refuge for Jews in Eastern Europe because it was more tolerant than other places. The Jewish population in Hungary before World War II was very large, well over 800,000. Over 600,000 Jews did not survive the war, dying of disease, starvation, as well as the gas chambers at Auschwitz. I do not believe that most Hungarians have yet come to grips with the enormity of what happened because of anti-Semites who were their leaders and much of the population of the country. As a side note, Safar's son, Adolf, moved to England and became the pastor of a church in London. He and Charles Spurgeon were close friends. Adolf wrote an interesting and instructive commentary on Hebrews from a Jewish perspective. It's kind of like Edersheim's book on sketches of Jewish social life, written by a Jew who knew what he was talking about. At this point, you'll be wondering, why study another Scotsman? This guy's name is James Stewart. Here's why. James Stewart, a Scottish evangelist, visited Budapest in 1937 and 38 on the eve of the Second World War. He held protracted meetings which received support from Methodist, Reformed, and Baptist. During those anxious days just prior to World War II, the average person had a greater interest in spiritual matters. Stewart enlisted Christians to pray around the clock. The meetings began in a Methodist hall, but in 2 days they'd outgrown it and moved to a German Baptist church. The second week they moved to a Reformed church building which seated 2,000. Soon the crowds were so big there was only room to stand. Stewart had gospel choruses and Christian hymns translated into Hungarian. After the preaching, he invited those who wished to trust Christ to come to the front. Scores of people did. The organizers then rented the largest dance concert hall in town, and soon it too was filled. The meetings ended by Christmas, but resumed again the following year. Campaigns were set up all over Hungary as students from the Baptist Training School in Budapest went home to tell their acquaintances about the revival. An especially large and successful meeting was held in Debrecen. In the spring of 1938, the meetings resumed at a writing academy that could hold 4,000 spectators. They spread sawdust on the ground, on the floor, and the horses were there during the daytime, and then they cleaned it out in time to set up a whole bunch of chairs that they rented and held the meetings there in the evening. And even this venue was packed beyond capacity every night for the 2-week meeting. On the final Sunday, 5,000 gathered for a youth meeting. Stewart left Hungary, but the revival continued. He made 2 more short visits during the war and 1 visit in 1946, right after the war. God changed the lives of many as a result of this revival. Questions? Okay, I've got a couple of more pages here. Moving back to Hungary as a whole, Joseph II proved to be a friend of the Protestants, but his rule contained elements of lust for power. Nevertheless, he resolved to disconnect the Catholic Church in his realm from bondage to the Pope and to give religious freedom to the Protestants. He tried to separate all the clergy in his kingdom from foreign influence. He forbade foreign inspection of monasteries in 1781. He ordered that no papal bulls should be published without the prior consent of the emperor, and he extended that to messages from Catholic bishops outside of Hungary and Austria. He issued an Edict of Toleration in 1781, in which he revoked the previous imperial edict that forbade criticism of the Roman Catholic Church. No more religious tests would be allowed for holding public office. The Protestants were now free to worship on private places anywhere. Building a Protestant church building was to be allowed. Protestants would not be required to swear by the decretal oath. Priests could not visit sick Protestants unless asked to do so. Rules concerning mixed marriage were improved, although they still favored the Catholics somewhat. The Protestants received the edict with great joy. In 1781, they held a meeting in Pest, which, among other things, issued an expression of gratitude to the emperor. Reactions of the Roman Catholics, on the other hand, were not positive. They protested, claiming that the edict was unconstitutional. They tried to resurrect 150-year-old laws commanding the burning of Lutherans. That law had been repealed by the Treaty of Vienna. Even the emperor's confessor warned him that he could expect no success against his enemies unless he reversed course. When these measures did not work, they publicly denounced the emperor as a Lutheran and impugned his motives. Joseph was not completely satisfied with the edict and resolved to go even further in limiting the power of the Pope. The Pope resolved to visit Vienna, and the emperor said, "Come, you're very welcome." He was received by a large and adoring throngs. They carried his slipper on a platter, and people would come up to the slipper and kiss it. Isn't that sweet? But while he was there, the emperor snubbed him. The emperor explained that he was no theologian and thus could not argue with the Pope. What the things that he had done were matters of state. The emperor gave the Pope a lavish gift and then sent him on his way with no other tangible result. The Jesuits being gone and the edict in place, the freedom of the press followed. The authority of the church to educate orphans born to Protestants and Jews was limited. Children of a certain age were allowed to request baptism, but they could not be forcibly removed from the homes of their guardians. Bibles, prayer books, and liturgies of the Protestants could now be printed. Confiscated books must be restored. Violators of the edict were punished. Okay, they made edicts before, but people who violated the edicts were not punished. This time they were. The Archbishop of Graz was called before the court for inquiring of the Pope whether or not he should post the imperial edict. So that's enforcement too. The emperor was so severely attacked that he was forced to declare publicly in 1781 that he would not leave the Church of Rome and that he would be glad if his subjects would be Roman Catholic, but that he did not feel free to compel anyone against his conscience. The emperor had to issue new edicts to reinforce the earlier ones. An edict did not solve all problems, particularly when the courts still consisted of the same people as before. For example, the emperor ordered the restoration of the Protestant church in Bohemia, but the court found a way around it, and he was not permitted to return. That's just a sample. The thing goes on for page after page to tell you of other abuses too. Joseph came to the same conclusion that the Protestants had come to, in that the bishops sitting on the court would not give justice when it was against their interests. So he removed the bishops from the courts. Further, when he closed monasteries, he saw to it that the money was not used the revenues of the monasteries and the money brought in from the sales was not used to benefit him or anyone else, but it was put into a general fund to finance education. Another war with Turkey broke out, chiefly in the interest of the Russians. Rebellion threatened the country. In January of 1790, the king withdrew many of his own reforms, and on February 20, he died. Leopold II succeeded his father. No, wait a minute, it was not his father. Leopold was his nephew, if I remember right. When the Protestants came to him with grievances, he turned them over to the Diet, expressing his desire that the matters would be resolved according to justice and the laws of the land. When the Diet made appeal to the emperor, he decided matters according to the treaties of Vienna and Linz, which had been favorable to the Protestants. Moderate Catholics were satisfied, but the fanatics were not. Since the Diet had appealed to the emperor to resolve the conflict, they had to accept the emperor's decision, and it became the law of the land, sort of, not just an edict given unilaterally by one man, which could be reversed by the next. However, before matters could be finalized, the emperor died suddenly in February of 1792. Francis I, at his coronation, promised that this generous nation never would have cause to repent the confidence placed in him. He soon forgot his promise, and the old ways returned, just as it had been under Maria Theresa. I should also remark about Maria Theresa, you know how the Habsburg line was about to go extinct? Well, she resurrected it single-handedly herself. She had 11 children, if I remember right. The power of censorship returned. The priests might compel the Protestant party of mixed marriage to give up the right to educate their children. No Protestant church clergy were allowed to tamper with the faith of a Roman Catholic. Even suspicion of such was punishable. Okay, they tampered with the faith of the Roman Catholic when the Roman Catholic voluntarily came to a Protestant service and listened to the preaching. That was tampering with the Roman Catholic's faith. The Roman Catholics used the French Revolution as an argument that they were the only bulwark against anarchy. The priests had gained much influence over the magistrates, so that virtually all the privileges gained under Leopold II were reversed. Appeal to the emperor caused him to reverse what had been done apart from his knowledge. The emperor then called for a new diet, 1796. The Protestant petitions were not considered until the diet was finished. The petition, which was 60 pages in length, was not presented to the king until 1799. In the meantime, abuses continued and increased. I cannot list all the grievances here, but one stands out for its sheer malignity. A widow woman who had been a zealous Protestant all her life, which was nearly a century, on her deathbed asked for a Protestant pastor. Instead, her nephew called for a priest who thrust a wafer in her unwilling mouth and declared that she had converted. Even with a greater measure of freedom, the Protestant churches were not ready for it. They did not have enough educated men to be pastors in the new churches. Many of the old pastors were in a deplorable state spiritually. They lacked good leadership and unity. They took advantage of the death of Primate Cardinal Bacciani to petition the emperor in 1803, 1804, and 1806. Their petitions were not so much denied as postponed and ignored. Protestant pastors were forbidden to allow Catholics to attend their services because so many Catholics were being converted. The Protestants refused to abide by that order. Now all children are required to attend Roman Catholic schools. This move was totally contrary to law, but the authorities acted as if that law did not exist. This plan was a severe blow to the Protestants. The next blow was the confiscation of 700 Bibles provided by the British and Foreign Bible Society. The Protestants were forced to leave out expressions like the harlot of Babylon or Antichrist from their books. The emperor received a deputation from the Protestants in 1817. They pleaded their cause. The emperor replied that he hated no one for their religion, and he esteemed the German Protestants, but that he could not do so with the Hungarian Protestants because they forbade Roman Catholics from holding public office. That showed how much his ministers had misinformed him. The Protestants documented the fact that nearly all of the officers in Hungary were actually Roman Catholics. Concerning confiscation of Bibles, the emperor remarked that too much reading was dangerous to the stability of the state. They responded that the Roman Catholic countries of Italy and France, in those countries, there were many infidels, but nobody ascribed this problem to the Church of Rome. They were dismissed with the impression that the emperor really did want to help them. Some days later, the deputation saw Chancellor Metternich. Is that name familiar to anybody? Okay. After the Napoleonic Wars, the nations of Europe gathered in Vienna, and they had a conference to decide what was going to happen to all the countries that France had conquered, who was going to rule them, what their borders were going to be. Metternich was the guy who controlled that conference. He was a political genius, and basically his redrawing of the lines of the political map in Europe contributed to the fact that there was no other major war in Europe for 100 years. So he was a very skilled politician. All right, they pointed out that their accusers could not at the same time be their judges. The Protestants were by far the majority of the soldiers in the army who had just fought in defense of the country, yet only 1 in 200 magistrates were Protestant. Metternich acknowledged the rightness of their case and promised to intercede for them. But that was it. Nothing happened. In the matter of education, the Protestants could not agree on what form their reform should take, where and what kind their schools should be. Worse still, the after effects of the war included inflation of the currency and famine. These trials brought out the generosity of noble Protestant men of wealth. Still, the Protestants suffered from disunity. The Lutherans celebrated the Jubilee of the Reformation. The British and Foreign Bible Society sent 500 Bibles for the event. New efforts were made to ensure the education and orthodoxy of the candidates for the ministry. However, under pretext, the Hungarian students were not permitted to attend German universities. The authorities threw difficulties in the way of new faculty members being added to the native universities. A new deputation went to the court with these and other complaints, but they went away disappointed. The sale of Bibles was prohibited. Ferdinand V succeeded to the throne in 1835. Things continued as they were because Metternich was still in charge. It was more like the emperor was sort of a figurehead. Metternich ran things. This brings us to the point of the Hungarian Revolution in 1848-49. At the Diet held in 47-48, things looked very good for the Protestants, but all was lost in the failed revolution. And that brings us to the end of the history of the Protestant Church in Hungary. And that brings me to the end of my lecture. Questions?
Well, so in the end, yeah, that's a comment by John Glass that the thought that this is in the 1800s is mind-boggling. So subsequent to that, where your story ends, does Hungary actually become, how do they say, separation of the state and religious?
Not exactly. There are four religions are recognized as the religions of the country: Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Protestant, and Jewish. There's a second level where um, they're they're favored, and that would include the Baptist Union, the Brethren, the Seventh-day Adventists. Those would all be on that level, and then the cults that have come in from the outside would be on the bottom level: Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and so on.
Right. There's another question here. So what is going on currently as far as training institutions for ministry? I suppose this is currently.
Yes. You have Word of Life has a Bible Institute near Budapest. I don't particularly like their music. I don't like their associations because they're fist and glove with the Baptist Union. But other than that, their Bible teaching is pretty decent. The Baptists have what they call a seminary in Budapest. It's really more like a Bible college, and you can get some good Bible training there. Although I think the teachers there are strongly influenced by the Southern Baptists because several of them have studied in the United States at Southern Baptist schools. Then there's what we have tried to do. That is, we have you had a Bible Institute in our church, and two of our men have gone out to plant churches in other places.
Right. Does the Baptist Union have any connection with the Baptist Union of Great Britain?
I don't know. Their biggest connection is with the Southern Baptists in the United States. We tried to find out how much money annually they receive from the Southern Baptists, and we can't. I suspect that the Baptist Union would have a hard time surviving financially if it weren't for the money from the Southern Baptists. The Baptist Union are members of the Baptist World Alliance and the World Council of Churches. So
very ecumenical.
Yeah, they're ecumenical.
Right. There's another question here. Is there any connection to the conflict war concerning Jerusalem in the 12th century? I'm not sure I understand that, but.
The Crusades went back and forth. One of them did through Hungary and caused a lot of devastation. The crusading army was out for plunder. They weren't out to regain the Holy Land for the Catholics.
Right. So the current state really for, how should we say, for conservative Christians in Hungary is really a remnant. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yes, but we have a great deal of freedom. We have freedom to do things that people in the United States don't have freedom to do. One of my coworkers put on a puppet show at Christmas time in a public school that told the story of Christmas. And then she started to pass out gospel tracts to all the students in the class. The teacher grabbed the tracts out of her hand and then passed them out to the students herself. Try doing that in the United States. We can stuff mailboxes with our literature if we want to. That's not possible in the United States. So yeah, we do have freedom here.
But currently so there is religious freedom, but the people themselves, do they treat religion as seriously, or they're more, how should we say?
When communism fell, there was a lot more seriousness than there is now. They were looking for something when communism fell, and they found it.
Yeah. So they found a new God.
Yeah.
Okay. One last question, and I think we can wrap up. Is there any unreached groups, people groups within Hungary?
The biggest one would be the Gypsies. It's very hard to reach the Gypsies.
Right.
They have been trained to be, a lot of them have been trained to be thieves, and to live off the government dole and not better themselves. We had Gypsies attending our church for a while. The pastor was very tenderhearted and tried to help them. And he saw what was happening. He stopped doing stuff. They stopped coming. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
I hope you have.
Yep. We enjoy your lectures. Thank you very much. And I think we shall end